Hi everybody, welcome back to the second part of the conversation of this module. In this case, it's Islam and the West, not Islam in the West. So not just concerned with where Muslim people are at, but in this case, how they're treated and what experiences they have. And on the same token, how cultures, Western cultures, are viewed in the states of the OIC. This is a very complicated topic and one that I've spent hours and hours agonizing is maybe too strong a word, but thinking very carefully about how I should present it. And part of that's because throughout the wider blogosphere, different videos on YouTube, through social media, you could do a search on Islam in the West or cultural conflict or clash of cultures and just read story after story, watch video after video of very strongly held opinions on what it means to have the two cultures differing, and most of those take a pretty confrontational approach. It doesn't matter if they're written from a strong Muslim perspective or a strong Western Christian perspective. They often see inevitable conflict as the result here, which is really not typically the case. So I'm going to hopefully present a little bit more nuanced picture, and we'll see how it comes out on the other end. Now I wanted to start with the same slide, the same second slide I used on the Islam in the West discussion. So this is again the quote from the Charter of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the same sort of list of or cover sheet from resolutions that they passed a year or so ago. These are considered important statements about Muslim communities and Muslim minorities in non-OIC member states. That's a very important part of what the OIC does. However, it is a political organization, not a religious one. And this is really important to understand the difference, that we're not suggesting that they have religious authority over Muslims in the Western world. In this case, they have a political mandate to pay attention to the fates and the fortunes of Muslims around the world. So the Muslim world as a concept is different than Islam as a faith. And I think we've tried to emphasize that we're not here as instructors to try and tell you what the faith holds or portends or advocates for and on behalf of its believers. In this case, we're looking at the political world. Now, they are related in some cases, and you'll get an interesting lecture from Professor Daman, if you haven't had it already, about differing political systems throughout the Muslim world. And you'll see that sometimes there's very much a close relationship between the political leadership and the religious leadership. But in the case of the OIC, there is no religious component, no formal part of the faith that's in the OIC, except for the mandate and the rationale for bringing them together. But there is no religious figure in the OIC. So within Islam, there are many religious authorities, and they go by different names and different situations. They have different reaches into different numbers of adherents. They could be imams or muftis or ulama or ayatollahs or different things in different branches of Islam. What there isn't is, as I mentioned last time, a pope or a prophet or someone at the center, which means that the statements that are pronounced by the OIC are political in nature, not religious in nature. And it is something that does confuse the West a bit, because when they're trying to see like how they engage with Muslims, there's no authority, single authority they can turn to. So that's one of the beauties of Islam, and it's one of the frustrations that can be felt by people pursuing relationships with Muslims, is there is no center. In fact, there are things that are carried out by Muslims, just as there are things carried out by Christians and people of other faiths who other adherents of the faith would say, well, those people are not really Muslim, or those people are not really Christian. And those become very interesting religious conversations that can be frustrating to people in the West. So the decentralization of it is one point of confusion for the West. I'd say similar on the other side is there is no real West when you're talking about how folks engage with the Muslim world, because how Norway and the Scandinavian countries approach Muslim states is different than how the United States and the UK and France and states of that sort of ilk approach the West. But it is sort of glommed up into one concept of the West, or glommed up into one concept of Islam, when actually there's myriad different strands and approaches that have different strengths and weaknesses about the relationship. So one of the things that I struggled with was knowing or deciding whether I should go into specific examples of people or places in the West who are speaking out against maybe a Muslim incursion or against the Islamization of their national cultures, or if I should speak more broadly about issues that are felt in various countries and various places. So I've decided to go with the broad stroke approach. In part, that's because we only have 15 minutes. And it also is because the extreme examples are the things that we tend to hold on to. So if you say this religion or this people, that people are people of peace, and you say, well, what about this guy over here who did this really dastardly act? Then yeah, okay, that's an exception, but it typically isn't the rule. So we're trying to show here sort of the overarching pattern of what people are raising in the West about Muslims and Muslim communities moving into their country. So terrorism is an overarching one. It's been a point since at least the early 1970s where certain downtrodden groups have turned to terroristic attacks on the state and or on non-state parties and actors, just a populace, as part of their attempts to get the attention of Western actors and get them to change their ways. It is a thing that is not uncommon that people in the West associate terrorism with Islam. And it doesn't matter how many times you make the case or show the facts that this is not a common approach from Muslims that they will listen to or believe you. In the United States, we have far more violent and terrorist activity that comes from a nationalist right than we have from right wing than we have from Muslims, but that still is a popular perception. So the others are less sort of flagrant fears. And they're more concerns. So sometimes they are genuine concerns for individuals. So I'm going to start with headscarves. And headscarves is one that confuses people in the West because people in the West who are or favor feminist opportunities for people see the headscarf as oppressive. And certainly there are more and less extreme versions of this, whether they're burqas or hijabs, or other sorts of just basic headscarves may differ, but several European countries have passed laws banning headscarves in the interest of freeing women. And that many Muslim women would like to wear a headscarf is lost to them and on them. The idea being that if you're forced to wear a headscarf, that you are perhaps brainwashed, or something that you shouldn't have to wear a headscarf, and preventing you from wearing it should help you. It's a complex and complicated issue, but there are several countries who have banned the wearing of headscarves, and the European Court of Human Rights has upheld those bans. Typically because they also they don't specify that it's a Muslim headscarf, but that religious clothing more broadly, or in some cases actually countries specifically, the Muslim headscarf. Others are minarets and mosques. There's a concern not so much about mosques as a church, but minarets as for somehow offensive. This picture here is about an election issue in Switzerland where minarets were banned. So the popular vote held sway and minarets were banned. So that's pretty interesting that it's not the mosque that would have been banned, and that's part and parcel because they look more like, if you take off the minaret, it might look more like a church. Those steeples might look a little bit like minarets. But anyway, that's an issue that arose and wasn't through. Sharia law confuses people mostly because they only look at the most extreme versions of Sharia. They get obsessed with the idea that in some versions of Sharia law, that there are beheadings and hand choppings and other sorts of punishment by death, corporal punishment. When there's a number of countries that have Sharia law incorporated into their constitutions and legal systems where these things don't happen, Morocco and other North African states, they have Sharia law in whole and in part in their countries. but the idea of Sharia law is very fearful for people. And so these things are kind of conflict points in the West. And those things come up periodically, not for everybody, not in every country, not in every situation, but there are things that rise up. And just sort of the idea of acculturation of immigrants is one that makes people fearful as well. Now, on the other side, there are conflict points in in Muslim states. It's also not a monolithic issue. There are exceptions to this, and as I said, there's different Western powers or Western influences in the Muslim world, in the OIC states. But several topics that are common are these. So one is the U.S. Sort of unwavering support for Israel in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, this again isn't monolithic to the West. There's several West European countries that have recognized Palestine as a distinct nation state, regardless of what Israel wants. In other words, they have diplomatic relations and they treat them as two separate states. They may be campaigning and still working with Israel to get there, but they recognize Palestine's right. That's not true of the United States. We side very clearly and strongly with Israel, and that's a point of contention in much of the OIC. We've had a long history of geopolitical interference in the region that goes way back to the petroleum era, and that's from the United Kingdom, it's from the United States, it's from others. This picture is of the U.S. Forces in Afghanistan, where we have been since 2001. But we've been lots of other places as well. And if you go back into the 1950s, we rather infamously engineered a military coup, to topple the democratically elected leader of Iran and installed somebody who we liked. And it led to this long-term festering history that peaked in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, where the language comes of the great Satan of the West, that's the United States, where we start looking at the mad mullahs, the leaders in Iran, the Ayatollah and others. We have not had diplomatic relations with Iran since 1979, and that rhetoric is fueled on both sides. So it isn't as if it's a one-sided sort of rhetorical conflict. This is actually one that is strong in both sides. So the other piece you'd say is that Western culture is strong. Western culture spreads through popular culture through, I don't mean it's strong meaning it's better than others, but it has avenues of expression that can drown out local communities. And one of the challenges of globalization, of access to goods and services and products from around the world that has been part and parcel of the last 30 years of global history, means that there are certainly foodstuffs and music and film and other things that come from the West that threaten to drown out more domestic and local things. There's also pressure on expatriate communities that could be leveraged both by internal folks. So expatriate communities are simply your community of citizens who live somewhere else. So that sort of applies there too. We're looking kind of forward at what might come. So what are the arcs of a potential arcs of how the relationship between Islam and the West will play out? So there's four main ones, and you can read those here, that have played out so far. So there have been some countries in the OIC that have, at least on a short term, adopted adaptation and adoption. So Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, that was his approach after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey's a little bit less of a secular state now than it once was. Rejection of everything that could come from very strong religious political states that have rejected pretty much anything of the West. And so the Taliban's regime in Afghanistan pre 2001, before we went in, was very much like that, though there have been some others, Wahhabism and Salafism in some point. A critical engagement where you can adopt some parts of what the West has to offer while rejecting the rest. Is one. Can you adhere to the technology, the democracy, the constitutionalism that's inherent in the West, but not sort of bring in the cultural piece? And the other would be sort of abandoning Islamic traditions as a whole, which some individuals have advocated, but no state has advocated. Recognizing shared traditions there could be other ones, right? These are the four that have been tried most stringently and seriously to date. There's also some conversation that the failures of the West to respond to COVID-19 any better than anyone else in the rest of the world may suggest that ideology and approach is less important than practicality, and that whatever works may be the way people go forward from here. So my final thoughts would be that cultural differences, there's a lot of common touch points, which we aren't emphasizing enough in this conversation. But the differences prevail and people are still fearful of one another, though there are paths forward so that won't always be the case.